Hi there, I'm Emily Muhlstein with the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, and this is a public hearing video designed to explain to you and also to gather comments from you on a framework action that considers red snapper recreational data calibration and recreational catch limits. In 2019, the Council finalized Amendment 50 to the Reef Fish Management Plan, and that amendment dealt with state management of private recreational red snapper. Now, under that amendment, each Gulf state was allocated a portion of the red snapper private angling component annual catch limit. Also, each state was delegated the authority to set the private angling fishing season, bag limit, and size limit. And finally, an accountability measure was put into that amendment that made it so that any overages to the state's specific annual catch limit would be deducted in the following year, and that's called a payback provision. And this table simply shows you our current red snapper catch limits, buffers, and allocations for each sector, component, and state. So the main reason we're here is because the red snapper annual catch limit is expressed in the Marine Recreational Information Program's Coastal Household Telephone Survey currency. And I'm going to refer to that sort of from here forward as CHTS. Now, each of the Gulf states developed their own data collection programs to monitor harvest of red snapper by private anglers. However, sampling approaches vary by state, and they're also different to that CHTS program. So the state quota monitoring data is in a different currency than our current annual catch limit. If we want to compare apples to apples, then we are going to have to go through calibration in order to make sure that the estimates produced using one program can be converted into the units that are produced from a different program. Since the red snapper annual catch limit is in CHTS units, each state data collection program must be converted to those CHTS units to ensure that we are monitoring and setting the quotas in the same currency. So in other words, that we are comparing apples to apples rather than apples to oranges. Developing calibration ratios was a long and very involved process. In 2018, the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission, which is a collective of all of the Gulf states, met with NOAA's Office of Science and Technology and held a workshop to determine how to make the state-specific surveys useful. Then in August of 2020, that same group held a workshop to establish calibration ratios. And then the Gulf Council's Scientific and Statistical Committee met a couple of days later, and they reviewed the workshop findings and determined that the calibration ratios between the Gulf state surveys and MRIP CHTS are appropriate for monitoring the state-specific annual catch limits. So before we get too deep into the amendment itself, I think we should take a minute to talk about currency exchange, because it really does help illustrate what we're talking about when we discuss calibration of estimates from the different state programs or among the different state programs and MRIP CHTS. So if you've ever traveled to a foreign country, you may have had to take your US dollars and change them into whatever money is being used by the country you're going to. Now, in order to do that, you use an exchange rate. And we'll start with just an easy example here. If you were traveling to Europe and you had US dollars, you'd have to figure out the exchange rate in order to make sure that the US dollars that you changed were worth the same amount as the euros that you were buying, right? So for example, if I had 10 US dollars, I would multiply 10 by the exchange rate between US dollars and euros, and then I would end up with the proper or equal value in euros. And so in this case, the exchange rate right now is 0.836. So if I had 10 US dollars, I would buy 8.36 euros with it, and then I would have the same amount of money that I started with, just in a different currency. Now, to do that in reverse, let's say I was coming home from Europe and I had my 8.36 euros and I wanted to exchange them back to US dollars, I wouldn't use the same exchange rate because that exchange rate would change depending on which way you were converting your money. So in this case, I would take my 8.36 euros, I would convert them using the exchange rate or multiply them by the exchange rate, which for this exchange is 1.196, and then I would have my 10 US dollars back. Now the data currencies that we're talking about in this document are very similar to that. The CHTS and each state measures their harvest differently. So we would have to be able to exchange or have an exchange rate in order to compare the systems and be talking about values in the same currency. So as you can see here, we're just looking at that equation that we just used for our currencies, and we're superimposing it onto our CHTS, our state data collection programs, and we're using a calibration ratio, which is essentially an exchange rate. Things do get a little bit more complicated when we talk about calibrating multiple currencies. So in this case, each state has its own currency, and then CHTS is also its own standalone currency. So we're really dealing with 6 different currencies here. And since each one has its own exchange rate between each of the other ones, summing the units from the different currencies doesn't correspond to the sum of the units in a single currency. So for example, we'll talk about euros, US dollars, and yen. So let's say we have $10 US dollars that we're going to convert to euros, and we have 10 US dollars that we're going to convert to yen. Now, if I end up with 8.36 euros, because I've converted my dollars, and 1,086 yen, because I've converted my yen, that is not equal to the sum of those two things. It's not equal to 1,094 units or whatever. And likewise, since it's not equal to that, you can't divide it equally. So in other words, if I took and added up my 8 euros, my 1,000 yen, and I end up with this unit of, 1,094 of all of these currencies together, I wouldn't be able to divide them out and then assume that they would end up being the same value as the 20 US dollars that I started with. So that's going to be important for you to remember as we talk about alternative 5 in this document. Similarly, throughout the document, you're going to see the sum of the 5 different state currencies used. However, that's displayed for comparison purposes. And you'll notice that we've also converted all of those into CHTS so that we're comparing apples to apples. This slide shows you the calibration ratios that were developed during those workshops between NOAA's Office of Science and Technology and the Gulf states. You should notice that Texas has a 1-to-1 conversion ratio. That is not because Texas is in CHTS currency. It's because Texas has always had its own data collection program, and that their landings information has always been incorporated into the assessments as it was. And so for the purposes of this, they won't have a different exchange rate with the CHTS currency. And so you might be asking yourself why we're doing this. And the purpose of this action is to reduce the likelihood that we're going to exceed the red snapper private angling component annual catch limit by just adjusting those state catch limits to account for the monitoring programs that are used by each Gulf state. And we need to do this because we have to use the best scientific information available in order to prevent overfishing while achieving our optimum yield, which is consistent with a red snapper rebuilding plan. So let's jump right into the alternatives. So our first alternative is the no action alternative, and that would retain the state-specific red snapper private angling component annual catch limits, which were established in Amendment 50, which is that state management amendment. The state-specific allocation percentages and annual catch limits in pounds whole weight are expressed on this table. So essentially on this table, what you'll see is each state has its own allocation of the private recreational component annual catch limit, and those are expressed in MRIP CHTS. However, they have been monitored by each state landings programs, and so the states have been landing this number but in their own currencies. And what you'll see here is we're using the ratio calibrations, sort of those reverse ratio calibrations, in order to predict what those landings actually are in CHTS, which is the units that we're using for our annual catch limit. And as you can see, that far exceeds the CHTS unit annual catch limit. Let's talk about the implications of this alternative. It would allow each state to continue to monitor and estimate their landings using their own data collection program without calibration. But since the ACLs were generated using the CHTS and the state landings are not directly comparable, you can't land the same number in state currency as you could in CHTS currency. If we continued and chose this no action alternative, the private recreational landings may exceed the state-specific and private recreational component annual catch limits. And knowingly exceeding those annual catch limits is a violation of the Magnuson Act. So this is not a viable alternative. Alternative 2 would modify the state-specific red snapper private angling component annual catch limits using the ratio calibrations that were developed by NOAA's Office of Science Technology and the Gulf states. These ratios and the resulting annual catch limits in pounds whole weight in each state currency are expressed in this table. As you can see, for each state, we have the annual catch limit expressed in CHTS currency. We then have the ratio calibration applied and the resulting landings in state currencies. And then we even go back to showing you what the predicted landings look like in CHTS. And as you can see, the landings through this alternative would not exceed the annual catch limit set in CHTS currency. Also important to note in Alternative 2 that any future increases to state-specific annual catch limits in 2021 or 22 would be calibrated based on the ratio calibrations described in Alternative 2. Further, under this alternative, the Council will review state-specific annual catch limits as soon as practicable. So what are the implications of Alternative 2? So using a ratio-based calibration would reduce the likelihood that the private angling component ACL would be exceeded. The state monitoring program landings would be calibrated to CHTS currency. And if we want to, we can compare allowing the states to monitor the value of the Alternative 1 state-specific annual catch limits in their own currencies and applying these calibration ratios. Under Alternative 2, Florida and Louisiana would experience about a 6% increase. Texas would be unaffected. Alabama would experience a 52% reduction, and Mississippi would experience a 62% reduction. This alternative was the alternative that was recommended by the Council's Scientific and Statistical Committee. We'll move to Alternative 3, which would actually modify the state-specific red snapper private angling component annual catch limits by establishing a state management annual catch limit that is 23% below the private angling component quota. This table shows us the resulting state annual catch limits. So here we're starting with that private angling component annual catch limit in MRIP CHTS currency. We're applying the 23% reduction to get the resulting state management annual catch limit in state currencies. And then finally, we show the predicted landings converted back into CHTS. And it's important to notice that we will apply that 23% buffer to any subsequent increase that we have in state-specific annual catch limits for the recreational private angling component of red snapper. So the implications of Alternative 3 are as follows. The alternative would reduce the likelihood that the private angling component would be exceeded. Each Gulf state would still monitor landings in their own state currency, and each state would be impacted equally compared to Alternative 1. However, when compared to Alternative 2, which is applying those calibration ratios, Mississippi would experience a 101% increase, Alabama would experience a 58% increase, Florida and Louisiana would each experience a 27% reduction, and Texas would experience a 23% reduction. We'll move to Alternative 4, which is kind of a combination between Alternatives 3 and Alternative 2. So with our existing or our current annual catch limits, we would apply that 23% buffer that I just explained in Alternative 3. But the difference here is how we would handle any subsequent increases to the annual catch limits. The intention here is that we would use the calibration ratios and apply those to any potential increases to the annual catch limits. So we have two sub-options under Alternative 4. The first one is option 4A, and we would apply the ratio calibration to any additional quota if the acceptable biological catch is increased. Or Alternative 4B, we would apply the ratio calibration in Alternative 2 to any additional quota if the acceptable biological catch is increased by 25% or more. So Alternative 4 is expected to sufficiently reduce the state-specific annual catch limits to ensure that the combined state private recreational landings don't exceed the private angling component annual catch limit. The only hitch here is that not applying the ratio calibration unless the ABC is increased by at least 25% might result in overfishing. Finally, we move to Alternative 5. So Alternative 5 considers modifying the state-specific red snapper private angling component annual catch limits by establishing a state management annual catch limit that is 11.8% below the private angling component. This would be applied across all states equally. The resulting annual catch limits are expressed on this table. As you can see, we start with the annual catch limits expressed in CHTS. We apply that 11% reduction. Then we have the resulting landings in the state management currencies. And then again, the predicted landings that we would get out of this alternative in CHTS. It's also important to note that this 11.819% buffer would be applied to any subsequent increases in state-specific annual catch limits. So this alternative sets a buffer based on the total percent reduction achieved by calibration ratios in Alternative 2, but it applies it equally across all states. Now you might remember at the beginning of the presentation we talked about converting to multiple currencies and how you can't add them all up and then divide them again and end up with the same amount that you started with. So essentially that's what's happening here. Under this alternative, Alabama and Mississippi are expected to exceed their state-specific annual catch limits, and Florida, Louisiana, and Texas are currently harvesting less than the state-specific annual catch limits that are resulting from this alternative. So they would be allowed to increase their harvest. But overall, that would result in exceeding the annual catch limit. Since exceeding the annual catch limit is a violation of Magnuson, this is not a viable alternative. So there is a lot going on in this table. It is a summation of everything that we just talked about. It is each one of the alternatives and the resulting annual catch limit in both CHTS currency and then the different state currencies. And then at the bottom here, you'll see whether or not the alternatives would remain equal to or under our annual catch limits. So whether the alternatives are viable. So I would suggest, if you want to sort of take a deeper look at this, that the best thing to do is pause the video so that you can sort it out. So the Council plans to take final action on this document at next week's Council meeting. We'd like to hear your input before doing so. You can submit your comments online following this link, or you can simply email us at golfcouncil@golfcouncil.org. All of the comments that we receive before noon Eastern Time on Monday will be summarized and presented to Council before they take final action. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to send us your thoughts.